In exactly 47 seconds, one sentence would end a political career. Congresswoman Delia Ramirez looked directly into Secretary Kristi Noem's eyes and said the words that would echo through every major news network for weeks. "You lie with impunity." But this wasn't just political theater. This was the moment when 170 documented cases of illegal detention crashed into a room full of cameras. Noem thought she could deflect. She thought her prepared talking points about worst of the worst would carry her through another oversight hearing. She was wrong. Because Ramirez didn't come to debate, she came with court records. The hearing room fell silent as Ramirez laid out the first piece of evidence. ProPublica had found it. NBC News had confirmed it. More than 170 American citizens detained by immigration agents. Kicked, dragged, held for days without cause. These weren't undocumented immigrants. These were U.S. citizens caught in enforcement sweeps that targeted entire neighborhoods. Noem's face tightened as she reached for her standard response. The Trump administration has specifically targeted the worst of the worst. But Ramirez was ready. She slammed down a second document. ICE arrest data showing nearly 75,000 people with no criminal records swept up in operations. No violent crimes, no gang affiliations, no outstanding warrants, just people living their lives until federal agents showed up. The temperature in the room shifted when Ramirez mentioned El Salvador. This wasn't about immigration policy anymore. This was about federal court orders, direct defiance of judicial authority. In March, a federal judge had ordered the administration to halt deportation flights to the mega prison facility. The conditions were documented: rape, beatings, near-death experiences. The court said stop. Noem made the call to continue anyway. She admitted it on camera. The decisions that are made on deportations, where flights go and when they go, are my decision at the Department of Homeland Security. She paused, looked directly at the camera, and doubled down. We'll continue to do the right thing, continue to protect Americans no matter what radical judge comes out and tries to stop us. That's when every constitutional lawyer in Washington stopped what they were doing. You cannot ignore federal court orders. You cannot call federal judges radical for enforcing constitutional protections. You cannot decide which laws apply to your department and which ones don't. Ramirez pressed harder. Chicago had become a testing ground for chemical weapons despite explicit court prohibitions. District Court Judge Ellis had forbidden the use of pepper balls and chemical agents in residential areas. DHS used them anyway. Video evidence showed agents firing into crowds, children running from chemical clouds, families trapped in their own neighborhoods. The human cost was mounting: precision immobilization maneuvers on American streets, warrantless arrests in sanctuary cities, surveillance operations that treated U.S. communities like occupied territory. This wasn't immigration enforcement. This was domestic counterinsurgency tactics applied to civilian populations. But the most damaging revelation came when Ramirez talked about oversight. She had requested meetings with ICE field directors Russell Hutt and Samuel Olson, refused. She had formally requested a meeting with Noem during her October 3rd Chicago visit. Ignored. Congress exists to oversee executive departments. When that oversight is rejected, the separation of powers breaks down. Noem finally agreed to meet, but it was too late. The pattern was established. Lie to Congress. Ignore court orders. Reject oversight. Use force without legal authority. The constitutional framework depends on officials who respect limits on their power. Ramirez laid out the endgame with surgical precision. 3 options: resignation, removal, or impeachment, not threats, procedures. The Constitution provides mechanisms for officials who abuse power, lie under oath, and defy judicial authority. I've taken the first step towards your impeachment, Ramirez announced. I've called on the Judiciary Committee to open an investigation into your lawlessness. The hearing room buzzed. Impeachment proceedings for cabinet secretaries are rare, but they're not unprecedented. When officials systematically violate their oath of office, Congress has both the authority and responsibility to act. What made this moment historically significant wasn't the confrontation itself. It was the documentation. Every claim Ramirez made was backed by court records, arrest data, and witness testimony. This wasn't partisan politics. This was evidence-based accountability. The broader implications extend beyond immigration policy. When executive officials decide they're above judicial review, democratic governance collapses into authoritarian rule. Courts exist to check executive power. Congress exists to oversee executive departments. When both institutions are ignored, the constitutional system fails. Noem's defiance wasn't just about deportation flights or chemical weapons. It was about whether the rule of law applies to everyone or just to people without political power. Her response to judicial orders wasn't policy disagreement. It was constitutional crisis. The exchange ended with Ramirez making a promise that would resonate far beyond that hearing room. The American people will have justice. You will be held accountable. I'm going to make sure of that every single day. Not campaign rhetoric, a constitutional obligation. Democracy depends on consequences. When lying under oath carries no penalty, when court orders become suggestions, and when congressional oversight is treated as optional, the system breaks down. Power without accountability is tyranny by another name. This moment tested whether American institutions still function when political officials decide they're above the law. The answer would determine whether the Constitution remains a governing document or becomes a historical artifact. But the story doesn't end in that hearing room. Within hours, legal experts across the political spectrum were calling Ramirez's evidence presentation devastating. Former federal prosecutors noted that ignoring court orders isn't just misconduct, it's potentially criminal contempt. Constitutional scholars pointed out that no cabinet secretary had ever so openly defied judicial authority on live television. The political ramifications moved faster than anyone anticipated. Republican lawmakers who had planned to defend Noem found themselves scrambling for new talking points. How do you defend someone who admits to violating court orders? How do you spin radical judges when those judges were appointed by Republican presidents? Social media erupted with clips of Noem's admission. Noem defiance scandal began trending within 2 hours. Legal Twitter dissected every word of her radical judge comment. Immigration advocates shared the ProPublica investigation. Constitutional lawyers explained why ignoring federal courts matters for everyone, regardless of political affiliation. Behind closed doors, White House officials were reportedly furious about Noem's performance. She had turned a routine oversight hearing into a constitutional crisis. Her admission about continuing deportation flights despite court orders gave ammunition to every lawsuit challenging administration policies. Every federal judge would now question whether DHS could be trusted to follow future rulings. The El Salvador revelation proved particularly damaging. International human rights organizations had already documented conditions at the mega prison facility: overcrowding, medical neglect, sexual violence, deaths in custody. When a federal court ordered flights halted, it wasn't political interference. It was judicial recognition that sending people to torture facilities violates international law. Noem's decision to continue those flights anyway put the United States in violation of international treaties. Foreign policy experts warned that authoritarian regimes worldwide would cite American defiance of its own courts to justify their own legal violations. How does America promote rule of law globally when its own officials ignore judicial authority domestically? The Chicago chemical weapons incident added another layer of legal jeopardy. Federal law enforcement agencies cannot use military-grade chemical agents against civilian populations without explicit legal authority. Judge Ellis had specifically prohibited such use after reviewing evidence of indiscriminate targeting. When DHS used them anyway, they crossed from policy disagreement into criminal territory. Video evidence from Chicago showed children exposed to chemical clouds, elderly residents trapped in their apartments as agents fired pepper balls through windows, pregnant women struggling to breathe as chemical agents lingered in the air. These weren't military targets. These were American neighborhoods treated like war zones. International observers compared the tactics to those used by authoritarian regimes against dissidents. Precision immobilization maneuvers involved tackling individuals to the ground with techniques designed for combat situations. Warrantless arrests violated Fourth Amendment protections. Surveillance operations treated entire communities as suspected criminal enterprises. The constitutional implications extend beyond immigration policy. If DHS can ignore court orders about deportations, what prevents other agencies from ignoring judicial rulings? If cabinet secretaries can declare judges radical for enforcing constitutional protections, what happens to judicial independence? Ramirez understood that this moment transcended partisan politics. During the hearing's aftermath, she emphasized that constitutional violations threaten everyone. Today, they ignore court orders about immigration. Tomorrow, it's voting rights. Next week, it's freedom of speech. Once the rule of law becomes optional, nobody's rights are safe. The impeachment inquiry Ramirez announced wasn't political theater. House precedent allows impeachment of cabinet officials who violate their oath of office. Previous impeachments of executive officials established that defying court orders and lying to Congress constitute high crimes and misdemeanors. Legal scholars noted that Noem's case presented stronger evidence than many historical impeachments: documentary proof of court defiance, sworn testimony about lying to Congress, video evidence of constitutional violations, pattern of abuse spanning multiple jurisdictions. But impeachment requires political will from Congress. Republican leadership would have to choose between defending Noem and defending constitutional principles. That choice would define their party's relationship with rule of law for generations. Ramirez didn't just confront Noem. She defended the principle that no one, regardless of political position, is above constitutional limits. That defense matters because once those limits disappear, they're nearly impossible to restore.